right, thank you. Well, it's my great honor today to be the one to introduce Professor Serpil Opperman, even though I'm quite aware that Serpil Opperman doesn't do use active adaptation to this audience who all know her, but still for the sake of it, let's review some of her achievements. And first and foremost, she was the astute mind who had the idea, the great idea a few years back to ask Béné, why don't you organize an ESOC conference in Perpignan? And here we are today, and I could never thank you enough for that, so thank you. But this is not all of it. Professor of Environmental Humanities and Director of the Environmental Humanities Center at Cappadocia University, Serpil Opperman has served as the 7th president of sous from 2016 to 2018. She is one of the signatories to the World Scientist Warning to Humanity Second Notice, which was in 2017, and the World Scientist Warning of Climate Emergency in 2020. She is also a member of the Advisory Council of METI, Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the Turkish ambassador to the SLSAU, European Society for Literature, Science, and the Arts. Opperman has written extensively on postmodern, post-human, new materialist, and eco-critical theories, and with Serenella Jovino, who was our keynote a few years back and unfortunately is not able to be with us today, she helped develop material eco-criticism and eco-critical theory that she continued to expand on, further exploring the expressive creativity of everything that is more than human in the intersections of science studies and the environmental and blue humanities. And today she's talking about narrative agency in the wet matter, and she prompts us to blue our perspective in a talk titled Storied Oceans and Corals in the Blue Humanities. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. Thank you. I am really delighted to be here and honored to be here. And thank you very much for inviting me. Especially, I first would like to thank the organizers of the 10th ESOC Symposium and the University of Perpignan's transdisciplinary ecopoetics team, Oikos and CRESEM, for welcoming me to Perpignan. My special thanks, of course, go to Professor Béné Meillon for inviting me to give this talk. It's really a great pleasure, but I'd like to specifically thank Marie-Pierre Ramosh, Marine Dassé, Oliver Wilson, Caroline Durand-Ruth, who introduced me kindly, Noemi Mutel, Masha Cano, Domitia Giulia Berardi, and Julie Fortin. Also, Valentin Porcil. Excuse my pronunciation. So I'm really delighted to be here. It's a pleasure for me. As you can guess from the title of this talk, I'm going to focus on the oceans and their inhabitants as signifying forces that can construct a storied experience of their world, but I will especially be focusing on corals as specific examples. My talk will be on coral communication. But before we get started, I'd like to make an announcement. I have wrote the flyers of a book series I have initiated with Steve Mentz with Bloomsbury Academic. It's Blue Humanities. And anyone who's interested in writing a book on the blue humanities or waters in general, from any perspective, you're welcome. You can contact us. Here are the flyers. Probably Masha will distribute. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Extended to the blue humanities, mine is a material eco-critical approach that proposes a way of reading the messages encoded in agentic matter, considering them as narrative agencies. Actually, there is an alluring wonder in the concept of narrative agency. which is a material, eco-critical reconfiguration of the new materialist understanding of matter as an active, creative, and expressive agency. This element of wonder happens when we discover that matter's creative impetus generates stories, showing its meaning-making capacity to exercise some degree of expressive impulse, which makes it a narrative agency. So this concept refers to matter's narrative potentialities and owes its formulation to Karen Barad's definition of meaning and intelligibility. Meaning, according to Barad, is an ongoing performance of the world in its differential intelligibility, in which our cognitive capacities or practices also participate. Intelligibility is I quote from her, is an ontological performance of the world in its ongoing articulation. This is the key point here, ongoing articulation. This idea is what enabled us to conceptualize matter as story. For a story to exist, it must always be framed by some sort of articulation, performance, and intelligibility. In this vision, wet matter and its aquatic beings are read as part of the collective semiotic creativity of life. Such a reading can be accomplished through transdisciplinary forms of research at the intersections of the sciences, which provide systematic approaches to obtaining knowledge, and planetary poetics of water, which Steve Mance developed, which is an interpretive engagement with with the metaphorical vastness and discourses of all waters, salt and fresh waters. The Blue Humanities combines them in a context where the world's eloquence becomes legible. Science here should not be understood as an unmediated ground of truth with static answers, but as a testing ground of repeated experiments to gather knowledge of whatever is observed, which itself may change with new discoveries, such as that of matter's expressivity, which ended the previous knowledge of matter as an inert and passive substance. That the world is expressive is therefore not only a theoretical claim, but also a physiological truth, simply because all biotic systems interact with one another, in sharing information and energy in their processes of becoming. Now, this requires the ability to communicate. If you want to share information with other beings around you and with your environment, you got to have the capacity to communicate. Even the so-called abiotic systems can exchange information, like the non-local communications of subatomic particles. According to quantum physicist, the famous one, John Archibald Wheeler, all things physical are information theoretic in origin, and this is a participatory universe. This idea is further explained by theoretical physicist Carlo Povelli as a network of exchanges through which we pass images, tools, information, and knowledge. Material eco-criticism contributes to these scientific reflections by building a conceptual framework for thinking with and about this world that is entirely expressive. It claims that if the essential reality of all systems is interaction and sharing information, then all systems, biotic or not, must have some expressive capacity which makes them storied. Therefore, to say that whatever exists on this living planet is impressed with many stories of ecological and existential relationships is not a metaphorical hypothesizing. Neither is it a mere pathetic fallacy, which is attributing human emotions and responses to nature, as Victorian literary critic John Ruskin must have said, nor is it a conceptualization to grant water a meaningful existence. In Gaston Bachelard's parlance, I quote, "The voices of water are hardly metaphoric at all." Now, this is in keeping with the overall aim of this conference to discover and promote urgently needed ways of bluing our perceptions, worldviews, and ways of life. So, one of the ways To blue, our perspective is to be cognizant of the exchange of information, communication processes, and thus the semiotic creativity among aquatic beings. Marine biologists, oceanographers, and limnologists know this well by letting the data speak. And so do we in the Blue Humanities through this transdisciplinary cooperation for a deeper understanding of wet ontologies and current urgencies about human-water relations. Although we are not aquatic beings born of water, water has always shaped our cultural imaginaries with enduring dreams, desires, fantasies, fears, and mysteries. Since times immemorial, water has comprised a tableau on which material imagination has painted myriad poetic images, sensual values, and mental states. What are these? Uncertainty, unpredictability, vacillation, evolution, dissolution, impermanence, and especially connectivity inspired by blue waters. To exemplify what I mean, let me quote a Turkish writer who called himself the fisherman of Halikarnassus, and he described the astonishingly blue waters of the Aegean and Mediterranean seas as a sapphire or navy of infinite depths. They seemed an eternal blue. He says, the sea and the sky cannot be more blue than they are in Bodrum. Blue explodes, absolute, deafening, infinite. This wondrous blue was the metaphoric ink that the fisherman used to write his stories. He says, if that blue is the sea's own, then dip your pen into it and write blue on sheets of white. Creating a clear-sighted recognition of connections between the vitality of aquatic habitats and the dynamism of human poetics, the fisherman epitomizes what I will call a poetic submergence into planetary waters. The fisherman knew exactly how such a submergence helps extend our relations to water worlds to recognize water's elemental intelligence and voices, as well as water's geophysical constitution. The dynamics of our relations with water are thus intricately shaped by its twofold nature. I will now quote from myself. I call this water, the seas, the oceans, all waters actually, or water, is a physical, geographical site and a vast domain of imagination that can never be conclusively charted. Now, this is simultaneously literal and figurative element, not only invites a figurative submergence in its aesthetic modalities, but also encourages us to incorporate water-based knowledge into our predominantly land-based epistemological frameworks. Hawaiian scholar Karen Animoto Ingersoll defines this epistemic configuration as the fluvial addition to the territorial within a seascape epistemology that, she says, splashes alternatives onto the Western dominant and linear mindset that has led the world towards realities of mass industrialization as well as cultural and individual assimilation. There is no doubt that the life rhythms, biophysical linkages, recursive cycles, and interactions of aquatic multispecies are relentlessly disrupted, and that aquatic life can no longer exceed systems of domination that continue to trumpet in the language of and mentality of conquest. And this results in the regretful decline of hydrological systems. Hydrology, you may know, is the scientific study of the chemical and physical properties of all Earth's waters. Behind this decline lies an anthropocentric mindset that has determined a whole series of intersectional oppressions based on species, race, and gender, as well as a more radical ontological division between natures and cultures. Now, this disenchanted vision, as Béné Meillon defines it, has been propagating throughout the centuries. And it has primarily affected the ontology of those claiming to be modern in a Western white male-dominated society. So, conquered, hyper-commodified, engineered, diverted, dammed, choked with plastics, and colonized by capitalist systems, all hydrological systems today loudly protest human betrayal and the mastering visions of reality that shape the collective social memory and cultural imaginaries of planetary waterscapes. Water, in turn, reacts with extreme floods, anomalies in water quality, drying up of wetlands, and aquatic species gone awry. A specific and funny example of aquatic protest against human colonization of the oceans is the famous jellyfish attack in 2006 on the world's most modern aircraft carrier, the USS Ronald Reagan, capable of destroying an entire nation's armed forces. Was this in your news here in France or in the States, maybe? No? But that was a big thing, you know? As you can see, this is the world's most formidable aircraft. I mean, it can destroy an entire nation's armed forces. However, the jellyfish rendered it totally inefficient when thousands of jellyfish were sucked into the condensers while the ship was docked in the port of Brisbane, Australia. Ironically, the commander of U.S. Naval Air Forces called this incident, I quote, an acute case of fouling. This is a clear instance of how humans, to use another friend, my good friend, Francois Besson's words, this is a clear instance of how humans have ceased hearing the chant of the world. And she says, disenchantment comes from the fact that we have ceased hearing the chant of the world because it is too often muffled by noise and screams caused by war and violence. But there is a scientific explanation for that. And it is remarkable. A scientific explanation to the disenchantment. And this comes from quantum physicist David Bohm, who claims that our action toward the whole universe is a result of what it means to us, and the rest of the universe acts signosomatically to us according to what we mean to it. Here, signosomatic is used as the unity of mental and physical states, or signosomatic refers to the combination of matter and meaning. Signa means meaning, soma means material structure. What David Bohm means that the meaning of something affects the physical. Okay? So how we perceive the world affects how the world responds to us. It all boils down to this understanding. Another scientist, geomicrobiologist Frank Rees, provides a clear observation of such signosomatic actions, noting that the disenchanted life now extends far deeper into the Earth's subsurface, affecting the genetic and metabolic diversity of bacteria and archaea communities there. The non-biodegradable high concentration of microplastics, as you see here, right? These are called MPs, found in seafloor sediments are irreversibly altering the biological processes of benthic fauna, as well as bristle and tubivex worms, amphipods, and mollusks, as well as shellfish, terribly affected. When microplastics are broken down into nanoplastic particles, they can also reduce planktonic algae biomass and alter their photosynthetic capacity. There are attempts to remove this debris from the seafloor, but this is more dangerous than leaving this contamination there. More tragic plastic conquest is detected in the epipelagic zone of the oceans where sperm whales live here. This is, I'll leave it, it's gone. It is also ongoing in the Arctic region and in Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean. This surely is the agony of water, as Jean-Paul Sartre would have said. Although Sartre referred to slime as the agony of water, I think he would have agreed with us today that this plastic is the agony of water. If the plastic takeover is water's real agony, we need to understand and recognize how it is communicated. Such a recognition entails a new understanding of wet environments as sites replete with potentic agentic power that pull the allegedly separate human back into the collective life circle. The animate waterscapes, in other words, are always semiotically active, with an expressive force that endures far longer than us and our stories, showing that all materiality, wet or solid notwithstanding, is never semiotically inert and therefore inseparable from the field of signification. This is principally a storied world where all beings and things can express themselves as narrative agencies. This is true, as Roland Barthes once rightly remarked, narrative is simply there, like life itself. Or as Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, claimed, everywhere we see narrative stages. This is also, in part, a biosemiotics view. One of the luminaries of biosemiotics, Wendy Wheeler, argued that all life consists of acts of communication and relatedness, and that all living things communicate and respond in non-mechanistic, non-deterministic ways to their environment. All organisms are involved with meaning making, which is semiosis or meaningful communication, demonstrating that life is made of stories. Life is, in other words, is always storied, and life always evolves in communicative relations, and which invariably involves creativity. The fact that life's fundamental properties lie in meaning-making process, or processes in the plural, is not solely based on biosemiotics inferences. Scientists consolidate the biosemiotic view with the laws of physics. Not only does life on this planet unfold in meaning-making, they claim, but also the entire cosmos is deeply ingrained in meaning-making. I'm now going to quote David Bohm again, who affirms that meaning is fundamental to what life is. Meaning penetrates the cosmos. And he adds that evolution of life included a creative unfoldment of further meanings. So meaning-making is the diagnostic character of the evolving self-articulate universe, which reflects what astrophysicist Eric Chesson calls a rich and abiding story of our origins that is nothing less than an epic of creation as understood by modern science. Brian Swaim similarly contends that if meaning is essential to the cosmos, then we all live within an ongoing cosmic story where each creature is a story, which is also the core tenet of material eco-criticism. So this outlook opens up the conditions of possibility of theorizing matter as storied. And storied matter provides possibilities for thinking outside the box by going beyond anthropocentric understandings of the world. What I mean is that storing the world is not at the capacity of human subjects only. It is integral to all beings as part of their relation and meaning-making practices. Or, as Karen Barad would say, non-human storying is a particular form of interacting and as such part of the world. Storied matter, however, shouldn't be confused with the absurd assumption that matter is nothing but a textual construct. This is a schizophrenic feature of the linguistic turn and not even of post-structuralist thought with its challenge of realism that presumes a natural link between the world and word. So when we talk about storied matter, we refer to patterns of signification in the agency of all things. And we see a network of signifying forces with creative expressions that contain records of their own history and ours. In watery realms, for instance, seashells are more accurate recorders of human history than the humans who wrote it down. Because, as one scientist says, they recorded a fossil diary for 500 million years. Where did I, hang on. There you go. Seashells, this Cynthia Barnett, The Sound of the Sea, says this. So they recorded a fossil diary for 500 million years, leaving one of Earth's most complete archives of past life and global change. Now, corals, too, are enduring producers of geobiological history, holding records of past environmental and climatic conditions. Studying geochemical records preserved in coral skeleton, scientists consider corals as natural archives of paleo-environmental conditions in tropical and subtropical waters. Corals are the original scribes who wrote the world ocean's book of life, following the narratives that book that they wrote, corals wrote. We can clearly see that the lexicon of their narratives, impressed with meanings, projects an image of the more than human world that is never mute and never meaningless. This is a discourse that denaturalizes anthropocentric foundations of traditional knowledge practices, established meaning systems, and cultural imaginaries. Learning different notions of eloquence in more than human environments restructures our imaginations and erodes dualisms, the nature-culture divide being the backbone of them all. Recognizing this potential requires creative and critical thinking and scientific research to foreground the importance of informed awareness observed among aquatic species. The aim here is to transform our objectifying attitude to waterscapes and generate perceptual change, which is the capacity to perceive and be affected by the stories of aquatic entities in such a way that we not only become receptive to their condition, but also become aware of how invasive economic practices produce cycles of pollution in the oceans and how our cultural meanings and political decisions are enmeshed in their production. Hence the reason why water semiotic waves are so interesting to me. I will now draw your attention to the belated recognition of aquatic stories conveyed in signs, sounds, colors, chemical signals, and gestures, which we read as creative expressions. We are all now familiar, we've listened to talks here with how whales communicate, how dolphins, octopuses even, and turtles communicate. They use intelligible sound systems. For example, clicks and whistles, vocalization, color, touch, and body motions. We also know how deep-sea creatures, as you see here, communicate using bioluminescence as a splendid sign language. These are, what you see there are blind tripod fishes and pelagic giant tube worms living at the edge of hydrothermal vents in crushing pressures of the Pacific Ocean's dark zone. Bioluminescence is a language that has the potential to assume a narrative voice as it carries meanings understood by the communities of other beings around. Corals' lively practices of communication are as distinctive as the expressive capacities of all these oceanic beings or ocean-dwelling beings. The scientific information about coral physiology reveals something very important. This is from coral scientists. Corals are unexpectedly complex and remarkably similar to those of vertebrates, and they have intelligent signaling mechanisms. Douglas Chadwick, a wildlife biologist, admits that coral reefs, there you see him, that one, the first scientist, he says, the coral reefs may be warning us to pay closer attention, just as they can signal the pressures that modern populations are placing on tropical resources. The consensus among coral scientists today is that all coral reefs are sending distress signals about their decline. Peter Sale, as you see, a prominent coral reef ecologist, argues that we need their stories to drive the reforms that we must make. Just possibly reefs might help us act sufficiently fast to save them too. Now, being symbiotic assemblages of animal, vegetal, and mineral organisms, corals are complex benthic structures made of calcium carbonate, derived from seawater, and when subjected to water acidification, their pH level is really reduced, badly reduced, and this is an inevitable reduction. So to raise the pH of the calcifying fluid, corals continue to produce calcium carbonate, but in acidic seawater, they cannot bring the carbonate ions to the level required for their skeletal growth. Moreover, the existence of coral reefs depends upon coral animals, such as polyps, the first pictures, and they're not AI generated, by the way, they're real. Yeah. And these are animal-like creatures that produce calcium carbonate crystals. By being stacked on top of one another, these animals form a skeleton to protect themselves. This enables coral reefs to survive in colonies in which skeletons of numerous polyps are corallites, the science calls them corallites. These are skeletons of numerous polyps. They form domed structures, and this provides a nesting ground and food sources for other species, such as marine flatworms. But if coral reefs cannot maintain the steady state of carbon dioxide, dissolving it to build coral skeleton of calcium carbonate, they disappear for good. Coral scientists issue warnings about the decreasing numbers of reef-building species called bioeroders, such as tiny worms, urchins, sponges, triggerfishes, and parrotfishes, which feed on the algae and bacteria on rocky surfaces to dissolve carbonate rock so that the scale structure of coral reef stays intact. Scientists also warn about the impacts of macro and microplastics, as well as nanoplastics on corals through ingestion. Do we come there? Hang on a minute. Yeah. I will show you later. Now, when corals ingest nanoplastics, this causes oxidative DNA damage and alteration of expression levels of key genes, including what the scientists call MN-SOD, thus losing their defense against reactive oxygen species. Yeah, I think I missed this one. Now, although coral reefs cover about 1% of the world's oceans, they harbor the highest biodiversity of any ecosystem. 800 different species of hard coral help marine life thrive, as they are home to more than 25% of marine life. That is, 1 in 4 marine species live in or on or off coral reefs. This is a mutualistic existence. This is living in symbiosis. And this is most noticeable in the relationship between coral and microscopic algae, and is interpreted, this relationship is interpreted again by scientists as this is not a humanist talking, this is hardcore scientist talking, an infinite creative process. And this figures figuring symbiont corals as perennial scribes of aquatic stories since times immemorial. So they acknowledge that they are the scribes of stories since times immemorial. But these corals are now facing an existential crisis due to climate change and human-induced threats. Marine physiologist Virginia Weiss and marine biologist Dennis Aleman note that with the very survival of coral reefs in question, never has the information coming from corals been more important. They acknowledge that they communicate this information. So corals spawn networks of communication with at least 25% of interdependent marine species, and scientists call them halobios or halobios, depending on where you're from, Britain or the US, halobios or halobios. Halobios are collective marine life. I mean, this is collective marine life, all of them living together: fish, sea turtles, crabs, mollusks, oysters, clams, worms, sponges, scales, sea urchins, sea plants, also bacteria, algae, fungi. They form halobios, and what we understand from that is this dissolves species boundaries, and they form symbiotic assemblages, and it is necessary to continue oceanic biodiversity. Coral reefs also help us understand the value of oceanic stories in their emotional balance. The Great Barrier Reef in Queensland, Australia alone contains 400 types of coral, 1,500 species of fish, 4,000 types of mollusks, and 400 kinds of sponges. They all exist in symbiotic associations, living together, colonizing one another, and forming multi-species collectives. Acknowledging their inalienable rights as expressive beings with distinct communicative skills can enhance our receptivity to oceanic life, raise public awareness, and influence conservation policies and restoration projects. Now let's tune into the coral stories and talk about coral communities as bearers of their stories, which can be conducive to thinking with corals, and this can enable a better cultural and social cognizance of the precarity of oceanic systems, making corals appreciable in new ways. Now, like humans, all biotic entities, to use Michel Serres' words, can communicate among themselves through a kind of common language, which is necessary to code, to decipher the codes of others, to get decoded by others, to understand, mutate, invent, communicate, exchange signals, process of information, encounter one another. You're probably, all of you, familiar with Michel Serres' words.
How would you pronounce it in French? Biogia?
Biogia, I recommend that. It's a fantastic text and incredible. Corals express themselves. We are not anthropomorphizing here. That's out of the question. We are not trying to find similarities between these entities and the human world or human physiology. This is like Mark Twain works. There's nothing like that going on. We are simply trying to understand how corals express themselves, and scientific data gives us the evidence. So the corals express themselves through chemical signals, sound-related genes, and symbiotic algae to establish connections with their environment. They utilize signaling molecules as primary tools of communication for their semiotic interactions, which keep them safe. So in order to stay alive, they have to communicate. For example, if seaweeds threaten them, corals send out chemical signals to small goby fish that come to remove the toxic seaweed. Goby fish require organized sign systems for effective communication, which is crucial for their vital task. This is organized sign system, and it is understood and picked up by the goby fish. According to ecologist Mark Hay, these chemicals constitute much of the language in which the instructions of ecology and life in general are written. Humans, however, according to him, he calls them chemical linguists. Humans are chemical linguists, okay? But they are, for him, for the ecologists, are poorly equipped to understand the importance of chemical signals among organisms. But still, it's not impossible to decode choral or any other non-human expression. So choral language is comprised not only of signaling molecules, but also effective use of sound for communication. Now, during the heydays of COVID, I was researching this, and I came across a conference done online, marine biologists. And one panel was focused on choral communication. And there they presented the latest research. That was fascinating for me because they had found evidence of sound-related genes which enables corals to receive and emit sounds. Now I'm going to give you how they analyze this. Using a process called polymerase chain reaction, which is called PCR. This is PCR amplification, okay? To examine coral genes, they identified two specific genes, namely TRPV and FOLH1, folate hydrolase, which are associated with sound reception or emission in marine organisms such as sea anemones and freshwater polyps. Now, before this was discovered, they didn't think that corals would have such an ability, okay? Any sound genes would never be found in corals, but this was an amazing discovery. So we can say that coral sound emission helps other organisms find their way to the reefs, which is critical in maintaining the health of the reefs threatened by noise pollution or human-generated abiotic sounds known as anthrophony, caused by propellers of industrial ships, military sonar devices, or construction, installing oil rig platforms, pipelines, or conducting seismic surveys in the oceans. The International Coral Reef Initiative, ICRI, identifies underwater noise pollution as a strong contributor factor to reef deterioration and makes a call for urgent policy initiatives to implement effective legislation. So let's go back to the recent study, the recent discovery. This study was conducted on coral larvae, and this it was a year later that this new discovery was tested again in order to validate whether this is true. Or in science, you have to conduct series of experiments, not once, but you have to conduct thousands of times to validate the outcome. So this one here points to the small chance of baby corals finding landing place via auditory cues. So they were trying to figure out whether the baby corals can find their landing place using following sounds or the sound signals from the reefs. But this was muted by human-generated noise. Now, this study is published in Marine Pollution Bulletin in 2021, and it shows us the significance of coral reef soundscape. Here, the authors explain that the possibility of sound detection is enabled by cilia. Cilia are hair-like structures covering the coral larvae. Using cilia, coral larvae employ coral reef soundscape in steering towards healthy reefs and away from damaged ones, but their physical, physiological, and behavioral responses are negatively impacted by anthropogenic noise. So coral language, this is coral language. There's scientific evidence here that they use sound genes, and we, from the environmental humanities framework or perspective, we read them as meaningful expressions, and therefore we can call them narrative agencies. And they can, in my opinion, enable us to rethink human-ocean relationships. And if it is the case, it is in our interest to respond attentively to their emergent meanings from the productive multi-species perspective. The stories corals tell are important for actively changing our minds and hearts, as they are about their precarious relations with human activities, and they're about their collaborative survivals. So we can say that corals are narrative agencies endowed with stories and meanings that constitute collective expressions distributed among their network of relations. Reading storied corals involves creative and scientific perceptions of their habitats, which not only enable better cultural and social cognizance of the precarity of oceanic systems, but also make marine species appreciable for their own sake. This is true of all marine species, from sea anemones to whales. Paying attention to their stories and seeing them as expressive beings that communicate cautionary tales this is our vision, a material eco-critical vision that can expand our sense of awareness about their entangled fate with the overwhelming presence of human beings. So we need to think with aquatic species to ensure respect for them. And I think this approach enlarges our horizon of meanings to the wider water environments, urges us to act more responsibly as part of the world, and allows thinking across humans and non-humans in ways that emphasize the right to survive for all. If these beings are arrested in the flow of their tragic stories, and if something essential needs to be done for them, it might well be that we begin to give credit to their agentive powers, recognize their communicative skills, and appreciate their creative expressions towards the goal of achieving transformative changes. And I know you're getting bored.
Hello.
So let me reach my conclusions. So I just want to stress that the stories of aquatic species, the final matter because they help guide our attention. They help expand our sense of awareness about critical water ecosystems to inform policies to protect them, and they can drive us towards action. The urgency of the world demands this, and it is not too difficult because aquatic narratives are narratives of environmental justice, ecological resilience, and hydrological resistance. But not only, they are in chemistry, biology, in culture, and literature. Above all, they are in our memory banks. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you for this fantastic presentation and for helping us to conceptually reframe our reading of some overlooked marine species. Sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the stories told by, well, they're not whales, they're not dolphins, they're corals, and still we need to listen to their stories in order to, well, to also to survive. We need them. So we have some time for questions here. We have 10 minutes for questions, so feel free. And we have one first question over there. Wait for the mic, please.
Hi, Serpil. Thank you very much for that talk. I think I said to you yesterday that I fear that scientists in general don't actually know what reading is.
Yes, that's what you said.
Yes, and I now conclude that either they also don't know what narrative and language and other words that they use mean, or that they're mostly using the metaphoric. I don't think anybody in science or anyone in this room would deny the existence of biosemiosis, of information exchange amongst organisms. But the claim that that constitutes storytelling is what I want to contest, because narratives are made up of communicative elements, but they're not reducible to those communicative elements. You also talk about history, and it's not true that history is simply an accumulation of evidence. You know, a First World War battlefield can be an archaeological site, but it isn't itself the story of the First World War. To tell a history, is to accumulate material and textual signs and to organize them into an interpretation of how they came to be. And it seems to me that what critical materialism is doing is actually pretending that those stories either tell themselves or actually, for the most part, what we heard was that scientists tell. And that seems to me like a fundamentally self-destructive attitude for the humanities to have. Because if we don't really need interpretation, the natural world tells its own story with the help of scientists, then all we have to do is, well, with public relations part, right, just kind of critical, the ad moralizing, and that. So I do have. My question is.
Yeah.
My question is this: aren't you conflating information exchange, biosemiosis, which is real, with narrative, which is a structured organization of community developments that, as far as I know, only humans do?
We are not confusing anything here, and all these are reconceptualized. We are not stuck with the traditional ways of understanding narrative and communication and language, which are, in my and in our opinion, my group, human-centered. So if humans are narrative or can write narratives, but we don't take it in the sense of narratology, so can other human beings, beings. Biosemiotics gives us clues about how expressive biotic organisms can be, and they read their signals. I mean, this biosemiotics combines biology and semiosis. We interpret them, their expressions, as narratives. This is a way of reading them. It is a way. It's not the only way. It's one of the ways of reading. This is how material eco-criticism reads choral or any other non-human communication as stories. We are not claiming that they are writing stories, because when we use these concepts, inevitably our minds slide into, oh, only humans can write stories kind of thinking. But thinking with non-human species, perhaps we can change this conceptualization of narrative and stories to something else. Like Jane Bennett says, they are writing ontotales. They are tales of their own. The materialists also agree with this. But let me tell you something. I was in the laboratory of a renowned biologist in my former university, and he's a plant biologist. He absolutely refused. We saw plants are sending signals to one another. They're opening, closing, they're responding. He says they are not communicative. They are simply sending signals. This is not a story they tell. I mean, the biologist and I clashed. So, and this is it. This is the data. They send signals. But stop there. That's the data. Give the data to us. That's how we interpret this plant signaling. We interpret it as a communicative practice, as an expressive mode of being in the world. You may not agree. I'm not saying that scientists, as I said in the beginning, scientists have the final truth. They never claim such a thing. But they have come to realize that the whole universe is pervaded by real stories, as cosmologists have said that. You may not agree. But what I notice, while we slide more towards their data, many scientists, as I quoted, especially in quantum physics, tend to use more poetic language. Would you agree? They use, the language that we use more often than we do nowadays. That's something strange, but that's what's happening now. But the biologists there are many others who do not accept this. Although they conduct tests thousands and millions of times, they do not accept this molecular signaling as a communicative process. So you belong to that group, and we will clash. Well, and that's nice. From such conflictual approaches emerge new ideas. We may never agree, or perhaps slightly agree, about meaning-making practices. And another thing, when we talk about such things, in academia, there is another, but I don't like. So what's it good for people in Bangladesh who are diving to take corals? What's it good for them? We're not talking about, it is a post-colonial attitude approach. So how does coral communication help colored people in Indonesia? Well, I don't know. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how they communicate, and that's important for me. How this helps them. Maybe other sociologists will find ways connect the dots.
Another question, maybe?
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for talking. And I was thinking that one of the main problems when we're trying to speak with the more than one is to avoid the end of the morphism.
Excuse me, we can't really hear you. Could you check the mic? Maybe it's...
Can you hear me better? Okay.
Better.
No, yeah, I was saying one of the main problems that we encounter when we try to think with the more than human is to avoid anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism. And in this case, it seems like trying to interpreting these signals as a narrative, as a story, we are being, in a sense, anthropocentric.
It's a way of reading. It's a way of interpreting. There are a million other ways of reading. This is a material eco-critical way of reading this communication system.
Yeah, my question is do you think that in this sense anthropomorphism can also be helpful in our readings? Like, is it something that can drive empathy? Is it something that you support in a part, like in part?
Okay, I just said it's do we anthropomorphize? We don't, because anthropomorphizing includes, like, you try to find human traces of human language, human systems in their processes of relating to other species, to their environment, right? Yeah, like, are they like behaving like humans? They don't. We are not interested in whether, we can find common denominators or anything that, like, oh yeah, dolphins and whales, we may, but it's wrong. It's wrong trying to force it so that, they're like us, so let's protect them. This is wrong. What if they're not like us at all? We're talking about two different species. We may coexist together. We do. We have to relearn how to coexist together, by the way. But we don't have to really bring them closer to the human realm in order to appreciate them more. You understand what I mean? We simply have to acknowledge and respect the way they are and respect their life. They have a right to survive. Another biologist asked me, so do you mean that other viruses have a right to survive too? I mean, they sometimes pull it to extreme, some scientists, like, do you think that all the viruses, like the COVID, so do they have a right to exist? So this is reducing this theory to a very simplistic way of seeing the world. We will fight those viruses just like corals fight with their symbiotic algae when they are, for example, attacked by toxic seaweed. Sure. A coral has a right to fight against the toxic seaweed, and as humans, we have a right to fight against the virus, right? So that doesn't mean we allow everything to coexist together. Oh, wonderful. This is not a world of romantic illusions, Yeah. Okay.
So we have time for just one more question before attending the next panels.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm glad you started your talk with Gaston Bachelard's quote. And since I've worked on him quite much, I was interested if you could say something on how you integrate his work in material eco-critic perspective, and maybe what's inspiring and maybe what's problematic in his work from your point of view.
Will I integrate in work with?
Sorry, what?
Did you ask whether I integrate this work with?
No, I was just asking how you integrate in your material critic perspective his work, and if there is something you find problematic and something you find inspiring in what he say about matter and imagination. Stop talking about Bachelard.
Sorry?
Gaston Bachelard.
It's about
You
Bachelard.
quoted.
Yes.
Oh, I use a lot. Oh, yeah, Gaston Bachelard. Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed out. How much of Gaston Bachelard I integrate in my work? A lot of Gaston Bachelard comes into my work, because I mean, as I have underlined, this is not a metaphor. I mean, that non-human speak is not a metaphor. Their voices are not metaphorical. That especially that point is what attracted my attention, and I read his Water and Dreams, underlining almost every line. I will integrate in my future work more of his approach. Yeah, so I admire, and I'm in love with Bachelard.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We must stop here now. Thank you.